2 in the morning. Rain hammering the windshield. Matteo Russo had just left a meeting that ended in blood on his cuffs and silence in his chest. He wanted his car. He wanted to go home. Instead, he saw a familiar shape parked beneath a dead streetlight. Windows fogged. Engine off. Lights dark. He almost walked past it. Then he looked closer. Curled in the back seat, still wearing the dress she'd worn to work 3 days ago, using a folded sweater as a pillow, was the woman he had fired without blinking. His former assistant. Alone, asleep, with nowhere left to go. Matteo Russo had built an empire on never looking back. That night, kneeling in the rain beside her car, he finally did. And what he saw destroyed him. Before we go any further, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Are you curled up in bed, driving home late like I am right now telling you this story? I read every comment, and I'm giving shoutouts to my favorites in the next video. So tell me your city. Tell me your name. Now, let's get to the story. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight, the kind of relentless downpour that turned the city into a smear of light and shadow, headlights bleeding across wet asphalt, like open wounds. Matteo Russo sat in the back of his car, staring at his own hands. Blood had dried along his cuffs, a dark stain against the white fabric that his tailor would need to address discreetly by morning. The meeting had gone poorly, not for him. For the men who had tried to skim product off his shipments for the past 3 months, believing his organization too distracted by internal restructuring to notice. They had noticed. Matteo always noticed. "Sir," his driver said quietly, "we're approaching the office. Did you still need to stop by?" "Yes." Matteo's voice carried the flat, controlled exhaustion of a man who had spent the evening handling problems that required considerably more brutality than paperwork. "I left something in my desk." The car pulled into the underground garage beneath his corporate headquarters, the building dark except for the security lights that never fully extinguished. Matteo climbed out, waving off his driver's offer to accompany him, needing a few minutes of silence before he returned home to whatever remained of the night. He took the elevator to his office, retrieved the folder he'd forgotten, and stood for a long moment at his window, looking down at the rain-soaked street below, his mind still turning over the evening's violence, with the detached efficiency that had kept him alive and in power for over a decade. It was on his way back through the parking structure, heading toward the side exit near the loading dock, that he saw it. A car, familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why, parked in the far corner of the lot rather than the visitor spaces closer to the entrance. Its windows were fogged, condensation blurring the interior into indistinct shapes, and the streetlight above it flickered erratically, casting the vehicle in intermittent shadow. Matteo slowed his pace, some instinct honed by years of recognizing threats before they fully materialized, drawing his attention toward the vehicle despite his exhaustion. Then he recognized the make, the small dent along the rear bumper, the faded parking permit sticker for a garage 3 blocks from here, one he'd seen 100 times without ever consciously registering it. Elena's car. He stopped walking entirely, rain soaking through his jacket as he stood beneath the flickering light, staring at a vehicle that belonged to a woman he had fired 11 days ago. 11 days. He remembered the date with uncomfortable precision, remembered the cold, clipped efficiency with which he'd delivered the news, remembered the way she'd simply nodded and gathered her belongings without a single word of protest or explanation. He hadn't asked for one. Mistakes in his organization carried consequences, and Elena's mistake, a leaked shipping manifest that had nearly cost him $3 million and considerably more in reputation, had been significant enough to warrant immediate termination. He hadn't thought about her since. That wasn't entirely true. He'd thought about her more than he cared to admit, the efficient way she'd managed his schedule for 2 years, the sharp intelligence she brought to problems he hadn't even realized existed, the dry, understated humor that occasionally slipped through her professional composure during long nights preparing for difficult negotiations. But thinking about someone and allowing that thought to interfere with necessary business decisions were entirely different matters, and Matteo had made peace with his choice the same night he'd made it. Why was her car parked in his building's garage at 2 in the morning, 11 days after her termination? He moved closer, rain running down his collar, his shoes splashing through puddles that had formed across the uneven concrete. The windows remained fogged, obscuring whatever was inside, though as he approached, he noticed something that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. The engine wasn't running. No exhaust rising into the cold night air. No headlights. No indication that anyone inside had any intention of driving anywhere. Matteo reached the driver's side window and wiped away a small patch of condensation with his sleeve, peering through the gap he'd created. The back seat held a shape curled beneath what appeared to be a coat. Dark hair spread across a folded sweater that had clearly been repurposed as a makeshift pillow. The shape shifted slightly, a small, unconscious movement that confirmed a living person rather than abandoned belongings. Elena. His pulse spiked, something cold and unfamiliar moving through his chest that he couldn't immediately name. He straightened, stepping back from the window, his mind racing through possible explanations that all felt increasingly inadequate the longer he considered them. Why would she be sleeping in her car in his parking garage? Where was her apartment? Why hadn't she simply gone home after their conversation 11 days ago, resumed whatever life existed beyond the walls of his organization? He circled to the driver's door, testing the handle, finding it unlocked, which struck him as considerably more alarming than if she'd secured it properly. A woman alone, sleeping in a parking garage at 2 in the morning, hadn't even bothered locking her doors. Either she trusted this particular garage's security, which seemed unlikely given her termination, or exhaustion and desperation had overridden whatever caution she might otherwise have exercised. Matteo stood beside the open door, rain still falling steadily around him, staring at the curled shape in the back seat, and felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't experienced in longer than he could accurately recall. Guilt. Not the calculated, distant guilt he sometimes acknowledged when business decisions required casualties he'd rather have avoided. Something sharper, more personal, twisting through his stomach as he catalogued the details he should have noticed weeks ago and hadn't bothered to see. The same dress she'd worn to work the day he fired her, wrinkled now from days of continuous wear. The thinness of her face, more pronounced than he remembered, suggesting meals skipped rather than simply forgotten. The careful way she'd arranged her coat and sweater to maximize whatever warmth they could provide against a cold that had clearly settled deep into the car's interior. She hadn't gone home after he fired her. She hadn't had a home to go to. Matteo crouched slowly beside the open door, rain dripping from his hair onto the pavement, studying the woman he'd dismissed without a second thought 11 days earlier, understanding with sudden, devastating clarity that his cold, professional decision had carried consequences he'd never bothered to consider. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, uncertain whether waking her would provide comfort or terror, given the circumstances that had apparently driven her to sleep in a parking garage rather than seek help from anyone in her life. The rain continued falling around him, steady and relentless, and Matteo Russo, a man who had built an empire on ruthless efficiency and unshakable control, knelt in a puddle beside his former assistant's car, confronting for the first time in years the possibility that he had made a genuinely terrible mistake. Elena Vasquez woke to the sensation of cold air rushing into the car, her body immediately tensing with the particular alertness of someone who had spent the past 11 nights sleeping somewhere that never quite felt safe. Her eyes opened to find Matteo Russo crouched beside the open driver's door, rain soaking through his expensive suit, his expression carrying an intensity she'd never witnessed from him during 2 years of managing his schedule and correspondence. Matteo. His name left her mouth before she could stop it, disbelief and panic warring in her voice as she scrambled upright, the coat that had served as her blanket sliding from her shoulders. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, he said, his voice carrying none of its usual cold efficiency, replaced instead by something rougher, more uncertain. Elena's face flushed with humiliation as she registered exactly what he was seeing, exactly what conclusions he must already be drawing from the makeshift pillow, the wrinkled dress, the general disaster of her current circumstances. I was just resting, she said, the lie sounding pathetic even to her own ears. Long day. Fell asleep in my car. It happens. Elena. His voice carried a warning, the particular tone he used when subordinates attempted to deflect, rather than address problems directly, though something considerably gentler threaded through it now. You're sleeping in a parking garage at 2 in the morning, 11 days after I terminated your employment. Don't insult us both by pretending this is simply a long day. Elena's jaw tightened, pride flaring hot, despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the past week and a half. I don't owe you an explanation for where I sleep, Mr. Russo. You made it very clear 11 days ago that my life stopped being your concern. Where's your apartment? He asked, ignoring her deflection entirely. I don't have one anymore, Elena said, the admission slipping free before she could construct a more dignified response. She immediately regretted the honesty, watching Matteo's expression shift into something that looked uncomfortably close to horror. What happened? Does it matter? Elena said, pulling her coat back around her shoulders, suddenly acutely aware of exactly how vulnerable she looked, curled in the back seat of a car that had become her only shelter, being interrogated by the man responsible for the financial collapse that had led her here. It matters considerably, Matteo said, his voice hardening slightly, though the hardness seemed directed at himself rather than her. Tell me what happened, Elena. I lost my job, she said flatly, refusing to soften the accusation embedded in her words. Which meant I lost the income required to pay rent. Which meant, 3 days after you fired me, my landlord initiated eviction proceedings for a lease violation I hadn't previously known existed. What violation? Apparently my lease included a clause about consistent employment verification that I'd never actually read closely, Elena said, bitterness creeping into her voice. Something about tenant stability requirements. My landlord suddenly discovered this clause exactly 3 days after I lost my job, decided to enforce it retroactively, and gave me 72 hours to vacate. Matteo's expression darkened considerably, something calculating shifting behind his eyes that Elena recognized from years of watching him process business betrayals. That's not standard practice. I'm aware, Elena said, but I didn't have the money for a lawyer, didn't have the time to fight it properly, and honestly, didn't have the energy left to try. So I packed what I could fit in my car, put the rest in storage, using the last of my savings, and here we are. Where have you been staying? Here, Elena said. Various parking structures around the city. This one seemed relatively safe, given the security cameras, though I suppose I should have anticipated running into you eventually. Matteo stood abruptly, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair, something turbulent moving behind his controlled exterior that Elena had rarely witnessed during their professional acquaintance. You've been sleeping in your car for 11 days. 10, actually, Elena corrected, some of her natural dry humor surfacing despite the humiliating circumstances. I stayed with a friend the first night, but her lease doesn't allow overnight guests longer than that, and I didn't want to jeopardize her housing situation too. Why didn't you call me? Elena stared at him, genuinely startled by the question. You fired me, Matteo. You made it very clear my failures were unacceptable, that trust between us had been irreparably damaged. I hardly think calling you to ask for help would have been received well. You should have called anyway, Matteo said, his voice carrying an intensity that made Elena's chest tighten uncomfortably. Why? She asked, genuine confusion bleeding through her exhaustion. You made your position perfectly clear 11 days ago. Why would you suddenly care about my housing situation now? Matteo was quiet for a long moment, rain still falling steadily around them, his expression cycling through something that looked like genuine internal conflict. "Because," he said finally, "watching you curled in the back seat of this car, using a sweater as a pillow, has made me realize that firing you might have been considerably more consequential than I understood at the time." "Consequences are part of the job," Elena said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You've told me that yourself, multiple times, regarding other employees who made costly mistakes. This is different. Why?" Matteo hesitated, something guarded crossing his expression before he seemed to make a deliberate decision. "Get out of the car, Elena." "Excuse me? You're not sleeping here another night," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority she remembered from their professional relationship, though now directed toward her well-being rather than business efficiency. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." "I don't need your charity," Elena said, pride flaring sharp and immediate despite her exhaustion. "I've managed the past 11 days perfectly well without your intervention. I'll manage tomorrow too." "You're sleeping in a parking garage," Matteo said, his voice tightening with something that sounded dangerously close to frustration. "That's not managing, Elena. That's surviving through sheer stubbornness, which I respect considerably, but which doesn't change the fact that you shouldn't have to do this." "Whose fault is that?" Elena shot back, months of carefully suppressed anger finally breaking through her exhaustion. "You're the one who fired me without asking a single question about why the manifest was leaked. You're the one who decided my 2 years of loyal service meant nothing compared to one mistake you never bothered investigating properly." Matteo's expression flickered with something that looked almost like pain. "Elena, I don't need your guilt-driven charity now," Elena continued, refusing to let him interrupt. "Just because you happened to stumble across evidence of exactly how badly your decision affected my life. I survived before you, Matteo. I'll survive after you too." "I'm not offering charity," Matteo said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more deliberate. "I'm offering to fix a mistake I made, if you'll allow me the opportunity." Elena studied him carefully, rain still falling around them both, exhaustion and pride, and something considerably more complicated warring behind her tired eyes. "And if I refuse? Then I'll stand in this parking garage arguing with you until sunrise," Matteo said, something almost desperate threading through his usual controlled delivery. "Because I refuse to walk away again and pretend I didn't see this. Elena, whatever else happens between us, I won't do that." The rain continued falling steadily around them, and Elena Vasquez, exhausted and proud and utterly unwilling to simply accept charity from the man who had destroyed her stability without a second thought, found herself confronting a decision considerably more complicated than she'd anticipated when she'd closed her eyes in that back seat hours earlier. The rain was getting colder, or maybe she was. Elena realized, somewhere between one shiver and the next, that her teeth had begun to chatter in a way she couldn't suppress, and that Matteo was watching her with an expression that had stopped being anger and started being something she didn't have a name for. "Fine," she said, before he could speak, because if he offered his penthouse, she would have to refuse it again, and she didn't have another refusal left in her tonight. "Drive me somewhere with coffee, somewhere that isn't your building and isn't your home. A diner. The all-night place on 5th. That's it. Then you leave me alone." Matteo studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from his jaw. "The diner on 5th. Yes. And you'll drink the coffee." "I'll drink the coffee." He nodded once, closed her car door gently, and gestured toward his own vehicle parked 2 rows over. Elena climbed into the passenger seat with the stiff dignity of a woman determined not to let the leather interior or the heated seats or the quiet luxury of it undo her, and she very deliberately did not sigh when the warmth hit her frozen hands. The drive took 7 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Matteo drove with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, one hand on the wheel, his wetsuit darkening the seat beneath him, and Elena watched the rain streak the windshield and tried not to think about how long it had been since anyone had driven her anywhere. The diner was nearly empty, A waitress with tired eyes and a kind face who didn't comment on Mateo's ruined suit or Elena's rumpled dress. They slid into a back booth. 2 coffees arrived without being ordered, as though the waitress had seen this particular combination of exhaustion before. Mateo wrapped both hands around his cup and didn't drink. "Tell me about the eviction properly this time," he said. "Not the version you gave me in the garage to make me feel guilty. The real one." Elena almost smiled. "Almost. You want the real version. Fine. 3 days after you fired me, my landlord called. Said a routine verification of my employment had flagged an inconsistency. Said my lease had a stability clause I'd apparently signed without reading. Which I had, because who reads leases when they're desperate for an apartment 2 years ago and the job seems secure?" She wrapped her own hands around the coffee, letting the heat seep in. "He gave me 72 hours. I asked for an extension. He said his hands were tied. I asked for the clause in writing. He sent it the next morning, highlighted, as though he'd only just discovered it himself." "And you believed him?" "I believed the lock on my door when it stopped working on the 73rd hour," Elena said quietly. "I believed my things on the sidewalk. I believed the storage unit receipt that took the last of my savings." Mateo was very still. The coffee in front of him had gone untouched, a thin skin forming across its surface. 11 days ago, in his office, she had worn a gray blouse. He remembered that now with a clarity that felt like a punishment. She had stood in front of his desk while he told her, in the flat voice he used for terminating people who had disappointed him, that the leaked manifest was unacceptable, that trust was the foundation of his operation, that her employment was effective immediately concluded. She had not argued. That was the detail that had been gnawing at him since the garage, the detail he had filed away as guilt at the time, and was now, in this fluorescent diner at 2:30 in the morning, beginning to understand he had catastrophically misread. Elena Vasquez argued about everything. She had argued with him about his schedule, about his vendors, about the temperature of his office, about the brand of coffee in the break room. She had argued with a courier on the phone once for 11 minutes over a misdelivered package, and Mateo had listened through his office wall with something dangerously close to fondness. And when he had accused her of the single most damaging mistake of her career, she had said nothing. She had simply nodded, gathered her things, and walked out. He had told himself it was the silence of a guilty conscience. Now, watching her trace the rim of her coffee cup with a finger that trembled only slightly, he understood it might have been the silence of someone who had chosen not to defend herself for a reason he had never thought to ask about. "Elena," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "The manifest. The leak. 11 days ago, in my office. You never told me how it happened. Because you never asked," she said, not looking up. "I'm asking now." She finally raised her eyes, and they were dry and tired and sharp as glass. "And if I tell you now, Mateo, what changes? I'm already fired. I'm already homeless. The story doesn't get me my apartment back, and it doesn't get me my job back, and it doesn't get me the 11 days I've spent sleeping in a car, because the man I gave 2 years of my life to decided I was disposable over a single afternoon." The words landed with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed them in the dark, alone, more than once. Mateo felt something in his chest give way, not loudly, not dramatically, the way a support beam gives way in a building that has been standing too long on too little. He had been so certain, he had been so efficient. He had signed the termination letter with a steady hand and walked out of that office believing he had done the correct, necessary, unsentimental thing. He had not, it occurred to him, with a nausea he did not often feel, asked a single question. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were inadequate, and he knew they were inadequate, and he said them anyway, because she deserved to hear them from his mouth, even if they fixed nothing. "I should have asked. I should have asked before I let you walk out of that office, and I didn't. And that is on me, not on you." Elena looked at him for a long time. The waitress refilled her coffee without being asked and retreated. Outside, The rain had softened to a drizzle, the streetlights smearing gold across the wet glass. "You don't get to be sorry now," she said finally, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Sorry is for people who ask questions first." She was right. He had no defense. He sat with the truth of it, the way she had sat with the truth of her firing. And for the first time in 11 days, Matteo Russo did not know what to say next. He recovered before she did, because that was his nature, and because the alternative was to sit in a diner booth at 2 in the morning and simply absorb the damage he had done, which he was not yet built to do. "There's a hotel 3 blocks from here," he said. "I'll pay for a week. You rest. You shower. You eat something that isn't from a vending machine. We figure out the rest in the morning." Elena set her coffee down with a deliberate click. "No. Elena." "No," she repeated. And this time there was steel in it, the particular steel he remembered from the courier phone call, the steel that had made him hire her in the first place over a dozen more polished candidates. "I am not taking a hotel room from you, Matteo. I am not taking your money, or your penthouse, or your guilt dressed up as a room key. I have survived 11 days. I will survive a 12th. I have a friend who works nights at a hospital and sleeps during the day, and her couch is free on weekdays, and I will take that, because it is given freely and not owed. You can't keep doing this. Watch me," she said, and there it was, the sharp edge, the dry bite he had missed for 11 days, like a man missing oxygen. "I watched you fire me without a question. I watched you walk past my desk for 2 years and barely see me. I watched you build an empire on the principle that people who make mistakes are disposable. So forgive me if I'm not eager to now become a charity case in that same empire the moment it's convenient for your conscience." Matteo took the hit. He deserved the hit. He let it land. "I'm not offering charity," he said carefully. "I'm offering restitution." "Restitution," she echoed, and the word in her mouth sounded like something she was tasting and finding bitter. "That's a legal word, Matteo. That's a word for people who've done something actionable. You didn't do anything illegal when you fired me. You did something cold. There's a difference, and restitution doesn't fix cold." He had no answer for that either. He was realizing with a sensation that was equal parts frustration and something uncomfortably like admiration, considerably sharper than he had ever allowed himself to notice when she was on his payroll, when it had been easy to mistake her competence for compliance. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a crumpled $5 bill, smoothing it flat against the formica table with the careful dignity of someone handling the last of something precious. She set it down between them. "For my coffee," she said. "I'm paying for my own coffee. Don't argue with me on this. I don't have the energy, and neither do you." Matteo looked at the $5 bill. He looked at her hands, chapped from cold, nails unpolished for the first time in 2 years. He looked at her face, proud and exhausted, and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let him buy her a cup of coffee. Something shifted in him then, quiet and irreversible. He had spent his adult life surrounded by people who took, who calculated, who accepted his money and his protection and his attention as the natural tribute owed to a man in his position. Elena Vasquez, who had nothing, who had less than nothing, who was sleeping in a car with a sweater for a pillow, was pressing a crumpled $5 bill across a diner table to keep her dignity intact against him. He found, to his own surprise, that he wanted to know her, not the assistant, not the liability, not the woman he had terminated with a steady hand. Her, the one who argued with couriers and paid for her own coffee and survived 11 days on stubbornness alone. "You realize," he said slowly, "that the more you refuse me, the less I intend to walk away." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a confession," he said, and the honesty of it startled them both. "I'm not used to being refused, Elena, and I find that I don't want to be, by you, ever again." The diner was very quiet. The waitress was at the far counter, pretending not to listen. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the street glistening and black outside the window. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched her weigh him, the same sharp assessment she had once turned on vendors and schedules and misdelivered packages, and he understood that she was deciding, in real time, whether he was a man worth the danger of believing. "You don't get to want things from me," she said finally, quietly, "just because you've decided to notice me now." "I know," he said. "I'm learning that." She left the $5 bill on the table. She slid out of the booth. She did not take his offered arm when they reached the door, and she did not look at him when he opened it for her, and she walked out into the clean, rain-washed night with her head high and her coat pulled tight and her dignity entirely, impossibly intact. Matteo followed 3 steps behind because she would not let him walk beside her, and because something in him had already decided that 3 steps behind was exactly where he deserved to be until he earned the right to close the distance. And as they reached the corner, he noticed, with the cold precision that had built his empire, the one detail that did not fit: her landlord's sudden discovery of a forgotten clause, exactly 3 days after a private termination in a secure office, exactly 3 days after a leak that had damaged his operation. The timing was too clean. Matteo Russo stopped walking. Elena, 3 steps ahead, paused and glanced back at him over her shoulder, rain-damp hair clinging to her cheek, her expression guarded. "What?" she said. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, the guilt in his chest was joined by something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "Who else," he said quietly, "knew I fired you before you left the building that day?" Elena went very still, and in her silence, Matteo understood that the question he should have asked 11 days ago was not the only one he had failed to ask, and that the woman standing under the streetlight in front of him had been protecting someone, all along, from a danger he had not yet begun to see. Nico called at 7 the next morning, before Elena had even woken in the hotel room upstairs. "Boss, you need to see this." Matteo sat in his office, the same desk where he'd fired Elena 11 days earlier, and reviewed the file Nico had compiled overnight, everything connected to the security breach that had ended her employment. The original evidence had seemed straightforward. Elena's credentials, used to access a secured shipping manifest. A copy of that manifest, found on an external drive during a routine security sweep. Timing that aligned precisely with a period when Elena had requested, then been denied, additional access privileges for reasons she'd never explained. Matteo had looked at that evidence 11 days ago and seen exactly what he'd expected to see. Betrayal, a calculated risk that hadn't paid off, justification for immediate termination. He looked at it now with different eyes. "Pull the access logs again," he told Nico. "Every login, every keystroke, going back 3 months before the breach." It took 4 hours. Nico returned to his office that afternoon with a laptop and an expression Matteo had rarely seen on his head of security's face: uncertainty. "There's a pattern," Nico said, turning the screen toward Matteo. "Elena's credentials accessed sensitive files 11 times over 3 months. 10 of those instances align perfectly with her documented work schedule, routine tasks, legitimate business. And the 11th? 2 in the morning, a Tuesday. She wasn't scheduled to work that night." Matteo's chest tightened. "Show me." Nico pulled up the security footage from that specific timestamp. Grainy, but clear enough to identify the figure entering Elena's workstation using her badge and password. It wasn't Elena. It was Dante. Matteo stared at the screen, his younger brother's face illuminated by monitor light at 2 in the morning, accessing financial records that had nothing to do with any legitimate business function. "There's more," Nico said quietly. "I cross-referenced the financial discrepancy from 3 months ago, the one that never got properly investigated because you were dealing with the Ferraro negotiations. What discrepancy? $200,000, siphoned through a series of accounts, connected to legitimate shipping operations. Small enough that it didn't trigger immediate alarm, large enough that someone eventually would have noticed." Matteo's stomach dropped. "Dante, The timing matches gambling debts he accumulated with a private lender, operating out of the East Side, Nico confirmed. Debts serious enough that the lender had connections to considerably more dangerous people than typical loan sharks. Why wasn't this in the original investigation? Nico hesitated. Because Elena buried it, boss. She discovered the discrepancy first, during a routine audit she wasn't technically authorized to conduct. Instead of reporting it immediately, she spent 3 weeks trying to quietly resolve it herself, moving funds to cover the gap, hoping to fix the problem before anyone noticed. Mateo's hands curled into fists against his desk. She was covering for him. She was protecting your organization, Nico corrected. If that discrepancy had surfaced publicly, connected to your own brother's gambling debts and questionable associations, it would have exposed vulnerabilities throughout your entire operation. Rival families would have seen weakness. Investors would have questioned your control. Elena understood that immediately. So she fixed it herself. She fixed it herself, Nico confirmed. And when the manifest leak happened, when evidence pointed toward her credentials because Dante had used her login to cover his tracks a second time, she let you believe she was responsible rather than expose your brother's ongoing problems. Mateo sat back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what Elena had actually done. Not a single mistake, easily explained if she'd simply told the truth. A sustained, deliberate sacrifice, spanning months, protecting his organization's stability and his brother's safety at the direct cost of her own career and reputation. Why didn't she just tell me? Mateo asked, though he already understood the answer even as he voiced the question. Because she knew what you'd do to Dante if you learned the full extent of his recklessness, Nico said quietly. Gambling debts, stolen funds, using her credentials without permission, not once, but repeatedly. In your organization, boss, those kinds of betrayals typically don't end well, regardless of blood relation. Mateo closed his eyes, remembering the conversation in his office 11 days earlier. Elena's pale face, her request for 24 hours, the way she'd said, "I can explain, but I need time," before he'd cut her off entirely. She hadn't been asking for time to construct a lie. She'd been asking for time to find another way to protect Dante without sacrificing her own career entirely. He hadn't given her that chance. There's something else, Nico said, his voice carrying additional weight. I found evidence Elena had been planning to resign anyway, before any of this happened. She'd submitted applications to 3 other companies over the past 2 months, all outside our industry entirely, legitimate businesses with no connection to organized crime. Why would she plan to leave? I don't know, Nico admitted. But it suggests she was already looking for an exit, perhaps recognizing that continuing to cover for Dante's mistakes would eventually become unsustainable. Mateo stood abruptly, moving to his window, staring down at the city that suddenly felt considerably less controlled than he'd believed it to be just 24 hours earlier. I need to know everything, he said. Every discrepancy, every instance where Elena covered for someone else's mistakes without taking credit or seeking recognition. Boss, this is going to take time to fully. I don't care how long it takes, Mateo said, his voice carrying an intensity that made Nico straighten slightly. I fired a woman who spent months protecting my organization from my own brother's recklessness, sacrificing her career and eventually her home, and I never once asked her a single question about why she might have accessed that manifest. You couldn't have known. I could have asked, Mateo said, his voice sharp with self-directed fury. That's the entire point, Nico. I had the opportunity to ask, and I chose swift consequence instead of basic curiosity. He turned from the window, his expression hardening into the particular resolve that had built his entire empire, though this time directed toward correction rather than expansion. Bring me everything on Dante's current activities, he said, and find out exactly how much the Kovalenko family knows about all of this. If Elena's eviction wasn't coincidental, if someone deliberately targeted her housing situation after her termination, I want to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Nico nodded, already moving toward the door before pausing. "Boss, what are you going to do about Dante?" Matteo's jaw tightened. "I'm going to have a conversation with my brother that's long overdue. But first, I need to understand exactly how deep this goes, and exactly how much danger Elena might still be facing because of choices she made to protect people who never properly acknowledged her sacrifice." The investigation into Elena's eviction took 18 hours, and what Nico uncovered confirmed Matteo's worst suspicions with devastating clarity. Her landlord received a payment 3 days before issuing the eviction notice, Nico reported, spreading documents across Matteo's desk. $20,000, routed through a shell company registered to an address in the financial district. Which shell company? Meridian Holdings, Nico said. Same company that appeared briefly in records connected to the Kovalenko family's legitimate business fronts. They paid your landlord to enforce a lease clause about employment stability that he'd apparently never bothered enforcing with any other tenant in that building. Matteo's hands clenched against his desk. They targeted her specifically. They researched her thoroughly, Nico confirmed. Discovered she'd been fired from your organization, understood immediately that her circumstances created vulnerability, and manufactured a crisis specifically designed to isolate her, to make her desperate enough that she might eventually seek help from sources willing to exploit that desperation. Why Elena specifically? Why not simply target me directly? Nico hesitated before answering. Because they knew about the manifest leak. They knew Elena had taken the fall for something connected to your organization's internal security. They likely suspected, correctly as it turns out, that her termination represented an injustice she'd eventually resent enough to consider retaliation. They wanted her to come to them for revenge, Matteo said slowly, understanding crystallizing with uncomfortable clarity. Believing I'd wronged her, believing my organization had discarded her loyalty without cause, they hoped desperation and resentment might make her receptive to providing information about my operations. Precisely, Nico confirmed. It's a sophisticated strategy. Manufacture vulnerability, then offer resolution in exchange for cooperation. If Elena had come to them seeking help with housing, seeking any form of assistance during her crisis, they would have leveraged that assistance into demands for information about your organization's operations, your brother's activities, whatever intelligence might prove useful. Matteo felt something cold settle in his chest, understanding the full scope of what Elena had endured. Not simply consequences of his own hasty decision, but deliberate, calculated manipulation by a rival family, hoping to exploit that decision for their own advantage. She never went to them, he said. No, Nico confirmed. According to everything we've traced, Elena never made contact with anyone connected to the Kovalenko organization. She chose to sleep in her car for 10 nights rather than seek help from anyone, including potentially dangerous sources who might have offered immediate relief. Because she understood what accepting their help would eventually cost, Matteo said quietly. Or because her pride wouldn't allow her to seek help from anyone at all, Nico said, regardless of the source. Matteo stood, moving to the window, processing the magnitude of everything he'd learned in the span of 24 hours. Elena hadn't simply made a single mistake that led to justified termination. She'd spent months protecting his organization from his brother's recklessness, sacrificing her own stability and reputation without ever seeking recognition or reward. Then, after his hasty decision to fire her without proper investigation, a rival family had deliberately manufactured additional crisis specifically designed to exploit her vulnerability. This is my fault, he said finally. Not simply the termination, though that alone was catastrophic enough. My reputation, my organization's history of conflict with the Kovalenkos, created the exact conditions that made Elena a target the moment she lost her position here. Boss, you couldn't have anticipated. I should have anticipated it, Matteo said, his voice carrying raw, self-directed fury. I've spent 15 years understanding exactly how rival organizations exploit vulnerability, exactly how they manufacture opportunities from weakness. I applied that understanding constantly to protect my own operations. Yet I never once considered that firing someone connected to my organization might create exactly the vulnerability I've spent my entire career learning to exploit in others. He turned from the window, his expression hardening with fresh resolve. Elena sacrificed everything to protect Dante, to protect my organization's stability, and received nothing but my hasty judgment and unemployment in return. Then, because of my organization's ongoing conflicts, she became a target for manipulation, specifically because of her association with me. "What are you going to do?" Nico asked. "I'm going to make this right," Matteo said, starting with actually understanding the full truth, rather than continuing to make decisions based on assumptions and incomplete evidence. He found Elena in the hotel's rooftop garden that evening, watching the sunset with an expression that carried exhausted resignation rather than the sharp defiance she'd displayed during their earlier conversations. "I know about the discrepancy," Matteo said, settling into the chair beside her without invitation. "The $200,000, Dante's gambling debts, the 3 weeks you spent trying to quietly fix the problem before anyone noticed." Elena's expression shifted, surprise quickly replaced by careful wariness. "How much do you know?" "Everything," Matteo said. "The financial discrepancy you covered without seeking credit. The manifest leak that resulted from Dante using your credentials a second time to cover his continued recklessness. Your decision to protect him rather than expose his mistakes to me directly." "And the eviction?" Elena asked, her voice carrying careful control despite obvious tension. "The Kovalenko family orchestrated it deliberately," Matteo said. "Paid your landlord to enforce a lease clause specifically designed to create vulnerability, hoping your resentment toward my organization might eventually make you receptive to their manipulation." Elena's breath caught, understanding crystallizing across her features. "They wanted me to seek revenge. They wanted information," Matteo corrected, "about my organization, about Dante's activities, about anything that might provide advantage in their ongoing conflict with my family. They manufactured your crisis specifically to exploit an injustice I created through my own hasty judgment." Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of everything Matteo had just revealed. "So this isn't just about your guilt over firing me. This is about active danger, orchestrated specifically because of your organization's conflicts." "Yes," Matteo confirmed, "which means your safety isn't simply a matter of correcting my previous mistake. It's an ongoing concern that requires immediate, serious protection." "Because of you," Elena said quietly, though her voice carried more exhaustion than accusation. "Everything that's happened to me over the past 11 days traces back to my association with your organization." "Yes," Matteo said, refusing to soften the truth, despite how difficult it was to acknowledge. "I won't pretend otherwise, Elena. My hasty decision created vulnerability. My organization's history of conflict made you a target. Every difficulty you've experienced since I fired you connects directly back to choices I made and consequences I failed to anticipate." Elena stared at the darkening sky, processing months of sacrifice, weeks of unemployment, and days of homelessness, all connected to an organization she'd worked faithfully for 2 years, protecting people who had ultimately failed to protect her in return. "I need time to process all of this," she said finally. "Take whatever time you need," Matteo said. "But Elena, I need you to understand something clearly. Whatever danger exists because of the Kovalenko family's interest in exploiting your circumstances, I intend to address it directly and completely, regardless of what that requires." Elena turned to look at him, something complicated shifting behind her tired eyes. "Why? Guilt alone doesn't explain the intensity I'm seeing right now, Matteo." Matteo held her gaze, understanding that honesty, complete and uncomfortable, represented the only path toward whatever trust might eventually be rebuilt between them. "Because watching you sleep in that car, understanding everything you sacrificed without recognition, discovering that my own organization's conflicts created additional danger you never should have faced, forced me to recognize something I've spent years avoiding. He said quietly, "You matter to me, Elena. Considerably more than professional obligation or misplaced guilt can fully explain." The rooftop garden fell silent around them, the city's evening lights beginning to flicker on below, and Elena Vasquez found herself confronting a truth considerably more complicated than simple justice for wrongful termination. She was in danger, not simply because of unfortunate circumstance, but because powerful people believed she mattered enough to Matteo Russo to warrant exploitation. And despite every reason to resent that connection, some part of her recognized that Matteo's declaration carried weight she hadn't expected to feel moved by, given everything that had led them to this exact moment. Elena spent the night after their rooftop conversation, lying awake in the hotel suite, turning over everything Matteo had revealed. The discrepancy, Dante, the Kovalenko family's deliberate manipulation of her eviction, and underneath all of it, his quiet, devastating admission that she mattered to him beyond guilt or obligation. She had no answer for that yet. She wasn't sure she trusted herself to have one. Matteo appeared at her door at 8 the next morning, dressed for business, but with an expression that suggested whatever he'd come to say wouldn't wait for pleasantries. "You're moving into my penthouse," he said. "Good morning to you too. Elena, I'm serious. The Kovalenkos know where you are. They orchestrated your eviction specifically because they believed you'd become vulnerable enough to exploit. A hotel, however secure, isn't sufficient protection against an organization willing to manipulate landlords and manufacture crises. And your penthouse is different because I control every aspect of its security personally," Matteo said. "Access requires biometric clearance. Staff undergo extensive vetting. Nobody enters without my explicit authorization, and I've already increased protocols specifically because of what we learned yesterday." Elena crossed her arms, exhaustion warring with stubborn pride. "You realize how this looks, Matteo. The man who fired me now insisting I move into his private residence." "I don't particularly care how it looks," Matteo said. "I care about your safety, which currently outweighs any concern about appearances or propriety." "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one whose reputation gets discussed in whispered conversations." "Nobody discusses your reputation," Matteo said, his voice hardening slightly. "They discuss mine, and I've long since stopped caring what anyone thinks about my personal decisions." Elena studied him, understanding the stubbornness in his posture matched her own, understanding also that continuing to resist logical protection out of pride alone carried genuine risk she couldn't dismiss, given everything Nico had uncovered. "Fine," she said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "My own space. A door that locks, with a key only I possess. No staff entering without my explicit permission. And you don't get to hover, Matteo, or treat this as an opportunity to manage my life the way you manage your organization." "Agreed to all of it," Matteo said, relief flickering across his controlled features. The penthouse, when they arrived that afternoon, occupied the entire top floor of a building overlooking the harbor, considerably more opulent than Elena had anticipated, despite having worked for Matteo for 2 years and understanding his wealth intellectually rather than experiencing it directly. "This is absurd," she said, standing in the marble entryway. "It's secure," Matteo corrected, though a faint smile tugged at his mouth, the first genuine amusement she'd witnessed from him since finding her in the parking garage. He led her to a guest suite, considerably larger than her lost apartment, decorated in warm neutrals that felt surprisingly livable rather than sterile showroom perfection. "There's a private bathroom, a proper closet, and the lock you requested," Matteo said. "I'll have your storage unit contents delivered tomorrow, whatever you'd like brought here. I can arrange that myself." "I know," Matteo said. "I'd simply prefer to handle logistics while you focus on processing everything else that's happened." Elena moved to the window, taking in the view of the harbor stretching toward the horizon, sunlight glinting off water that seemed impossibly distant from the cramped, cold confines of her car, 11 nights earlier. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words costing her something significant to offer, given her earlier resistance to accepting his help. For handling this properly. For asking, rather than simply deciding. I'm trying, Matteo said, moving to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she caught the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and understated that she'd noticed occasionally during their years working together, without ever allowing herself to consciously register the awareness. It's strange, Elena said, being here, in your space, after everything. Strange how? I spent 2 years managing your schedule, your correspondence, the small details that kept your professional life functioning smoothly, Elena said. I knew things about your preferences, your patterns, details most people never noticed, but I never once imagined I'd actually be standing in your home. Does it feel different than you expected? Elena considered the question seriously. Warmer, actually. I always imagined something colder, more clinical, matching the reputation you maintain professionally. This space was designed before I fully understood what I wanted my life to represent, Matteo admitted. My mother helped choose most of the furnishings, actually, before she passed. She believed even dangerous men deserved somewhere that felt like sanctuary rather than fortress. Elena turned to study his profile, surprised by the personal revelation. You don't talk about your mother often. I don't talk about much of anything personal, Matteo said. Professional efficiency doesn't leave much room for vulnerability, or so I've believed, for most of my adult life. And now? Matteo turned to meet her gaze directly, something unguarded shifting behind his usually controlled expression. Now I'm standing in my mother's carefully designed sanctuary, having just moved in a woman who sacrificed everything to protect my organization and my reckless brother, wondering how I managed to build an empire around efficient control while completely failing to notice the most important things happening directly in front of me. Elena's breath caught at the intensity in his voice, the physical proximity between them suddenly feeling considerably more charged than simple professional courtesy warranted. Matteo, I know, he said quietly, stepping back slightly, creating distance that felt deliberate rather than natural. This is complicated. You need time, space, the opportunity to process everything without additional pressure from me. That's not what I was going to say, Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Matteo's eyes sharpened with sudden attention. What were you going to say? Elena hesitated, understanding that whatever she said next would shift something fundamental between them, moving beyond the careful professional boundaries they'd both maintained, even through crisis and revelation. I was going to say that standing here, this space you're describing as sanctuary, I don't feel like a burden or an obligation, she said carefully. I feel like someone you're genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply manage or protect out of guilt. Something warm broke across Matteo's expression, relief and hope combining into an emotion Elena had rarely witnessed from him during their entire acquaintance. That's precisely what I'm trying to do, he said. Understand you, genuinely, rather than simply managing consequences of my own failures. The air between them felt charged with possibility, though Elena recognized the exhaustion and uncertainty still coloring her own emotions, understanding that whatever developed between them required careful navigation rather than impulsive action born from crisis and gratitude. I need to unpack, she said finally, stepping back slightly, creating necessary distance, despite the warmth still lingering in the space between them. Of course, Matteo said, though something in his expression suggested he recognized the deliberate retreat for what it was. I'll be in my study if you need anything. He left her alone in the guest suite, and Elena sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, processing the magnitude of everything shifting around her, uncertain whether the warmth spreading through her chest represented genuine healing or simply desperate gratitude toward the first person who'd offered stability after 11 days of chaos. 4 days into her stay at the penthouse, Elena was reviewing employment applications in the study Matteo had offered for her use, when the private elevator chimed unexpectedly. She looked up to find Matteo already moving toward the entrance, his posture shifting into the alert readiness she recognized from years of watching him navigate potential threats. Viktor Kovalenko stepped off the elevator with the casual confidence of a man entirely unconcerned about entering enemy territory uninvited. "Mr. Russo," Viktor said, his eyes moving past Matteo to find Elena standing in the study doorway. "Ms. Vasquez, I trust the accommodations have proven satisfactory." "How did you access this building?" Matteo demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet Elena had learned meant genuine fury rather than performed intimidation. "I have my methods," Viktor said dismissively. "I came to discuss a matter of mutual interest, though I suspect you've already discovered the connection between Miss Vasquez's recent housing difficulties and my organization's involvement." "Get out," Matteo said. "Not until we've spoken," Viktor countered, moving further into the living space with deliberate confidence. "You see, I've recently learned some interesting details about a certain financial discrepancy your organization experienced several months ago. $200,000, connected to gambling debts your younger brother accumulated with considerably dangerous associates." Elena's blood ran cold, understanding immediately what Viktor intended to reveal. "That information isn't accurate," Matteo said, though his voice carried tension that suggested otherwise. "I have documentation," Viktor said, producing a folder from his jacket with theatrical precision. "Bank transfers, timestamps matching your brother's known gambling activities, and evidence suggesting Ms. Vasquez here quietly covered the discrepancy without reporting it through proper channels." "What do you want, Viktor?" Matteo asked, his voice tightening with barely controlled fury. "Cooperation," Viktor said simply. "Information about your shipping routes, your current negotiations with the Ferraro family, details that would prove considerably valuable to my organization's expanding interests. In exchange, this information about your brother's recklessness and Miss Vasquez's cover-up remains buried, protecting both your organizational stability and her reputation. And if I refuse, then this documentation reaches your captains, your business partners, everyone whose confidence in your leadership depends on believing you maintain complete control over your organization," Viktor said. "Imagine the questions that might arise. Learning your own brother's addiction created vulnerability. Your former assistant sacrificed her career trying to conceal." Elena stepped forward before Matteo could respond, her voice carrying steady conviction despite the fear churning through her stomach. "Release it." Both men turned to look at her, surprise evident on Viktor's face. "Excuse me?" "Release the documentation," Elena repeated. "I'm tired of my choices being used as leverage against people I care about. If you think exposing my decision to protect Dante gives you power, you're mistaken. I made that choice knowingly, understanding the risks, and I'm not ashamed of it." "Elena," Matteo started. "No," Elena continued, refusing to let him interrupt. "I spent months protecting this organization from Dante's mistakes because I believed loyalty mattered more than convenient consequences. I lost my job, my apartment, and nearly my safety because of that choice. I refuse to let you use it as blackmail now." Viktor's expression flickered with genuine surprise, clearly having anticipated fear rather than defiance. "Bold Ms. Vasquez, given how much you've already sacrificed." "I've sacrificed enough that I have nothing left to lose by refusing your manipulation," Elena said. "Publish whatever documentation you have. Let Matteo's organization know the truth about Dante, about my choices, about everything. I trust that truth serves us better than continued vulnerability to your threats." Matteo stared at her, something fierce and protective shifting behind his controlled expression, before turning back to Viktor with renewed authority. "You heard her," Matteo said. "Release whatever you have. I'll handle the consequences directly, rather than allowing you continued leverage over my organization or Elena's safety." Viktor studied them both, calculation replacing his earlier confidence. "This changes considerably less than you might hope, Russo. My family still possesses information valuable enough to complicate your operations regardless of how you handle internal disclosure." Then let's discuss that information directly, Matteo said, rather than continuing to threaten a woman who's already sacrificed everything protecting my organization's stability. Elena isn't leverage anymore, Victor. She's under my complete protection, and any future attempt to target her will be met with consequences considerably more severe than diplomatic negotiation. How touching, Victor said, though his voice carried less mockery than genuine reassessment. I confess, I didn't anticipate this level of commitment from either of you. Then perhaps you should reconsider your entire strategy, Elena said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice, given how thoroughly it's failed to achieve whatever advantage you were hoping to gain. Victor's gaze shifted between them, something almost respectful crossing his expression despite the tension still thick in the room. This arrangement, whatever it's becoming, proves more interesting than I anticipated. I'll withdraw for now, though I doubt this concludes our organization's ongoing conflicts. He left without further comment, the elevator doors closing behind him with a soft chime that felt considerably louder given everything that had just transpired. Elena turned to Matteo once they were alone, adrenaline still coursing through her system. That was reckless. Reckless how? I just told a rival crime family to publish evidence of Dante's recklessness and my cover-up, Elena said. That could destroy your organization's stability entirely. Or it could demonstrate that we're no longer vulnerable to manipulation, Matteo said, closing the distance between them with deliberate, careful movement. Elena, what you just did. Refusing to let fear dictate your choices, standing firm against someone who spent weeks trying to exploit your circumstances. That's precisely the kind of strength I should have recognized in you from the beginning. I was terrified, Elena admitted, some of her earlier bravado fading into exhausted honesty. I know, Matteo said gently, but you didn't let that terror control your response. You chose truth over continued vulnerability, even knowing the potential consequences. Elena studied his face, understanding the genuine admiration in his expression, considerably different from the calculated assessment she remembered from their professional relationship. You're not leaving, Matteo continued. Not the penthouse, not my protection, not whatever this is developing into between us. Victor's threats only confirm what I already understood, that you matter considerably more to me than any temporary crisis or organizational stability. This is complicated, Elena said, though her voice carried less resistance than her earlier protests. Extraordinarily complicated, Matteo agreed, but I find myself entirely unwilling to let complexity prevent us from discovering what genuine trust between us might actually look like, especially now that we're both choosing honesty over calculated protection. Elena nodded slowly, exhaustion and cautious hope combining as she processed everything shifting between them, understanding that whatever came next, whether Victor's threats materialized into genuine danger or whether Dante's exposure created fresh complications, she wouldn't be facing any of it entirely alone. Outside the penthouse windows, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware that within these walls, two people who had nearly lost everything through pride and hasty judgment had chosen, deliberately and courageously, to face whatever came next together, rather than allowing fear or manipulation to dictate their choices. The confrontation didn't happen the way Elena expected. She'd imagined it a dozen times over the past week. A shouted accusation, a slammed door, some cathartic explosion that would finally let her breathe. Instead, it happened quietly, on a Tuesday evening, over a dinner neither of them had touched. I keep thinking about the 24 hours, she said, setting down her fork. The ones I asked for. Do you remember? Matteo's jaw tightened. I remember. I stood in your office and said, I can explain, but I need time. And you looked at me like I was already lying. Elena's voice stayed level, but her hands weren't as steady as her tone. 2 years, Matteo. 2 years of managing your life down to the minute, and in the moment it mattered most, you gave me exactly zero benefit of the doubt. I know. Do you? She finally looked up at him. Because I don't think you understand what that did to me. It wasn't just losing the job. It was finding out that everything I thought we'd built, the trust, The respect, whatever this was, evaporated the second something looked bad. You didn't even hesitate. Matteo set down his own fork with deliberate care, the way he handled everything when he was forcing himself not to react on instinct. You're right. I don't want you to just agree with me. I want you to actually sit in it. I am sitting in it, he said, and something in his voice cracked open, rougher than she'd ever heard from him. I've been sitting in it every night since the garage, Elena. I built my entire life on the principle that hesitation gets people killed. That doubt is a luxury I can't afford in my position. And I applied that principle to you the same way I'd apply it to a supplier who shorted a shipment or a captain who missed a payment. I treated 2 years of loyalty like it was worth exactly as much as the evidence in front of me in that moment, and no more. That's not an apology. That's an explanation. You're right again. He exhaled, and for the first time she watched him struggle for words. This man who negotiated with rival families and never once seemed to search for the right thing to say. I don't have a good explanation, Elena. I had a folder on my desk and a manifest that cost me $3 million, and I made a decision in 11 minutes that took your entire life apart. I didn't ask what you'd sacrificed for me. I didn't ask if there was a reason. I asked myself one question: can I still trust this? And I answered it wrong. And I let you walk out of my office without a single word of doubt on my face. Elena felt her throat tighten. The anger she'd been carrying for 11 days plus 4 more, finally finding somewhere to go. I covered for your brother for 3 months. I moved my own savings around, trying to fix what he broke. I watched you fire couriers for smaller mistakes than mine, and I thought, she'll be different with me, because I've earned that, and I was wrong. You weren't wrong to expect that, Matteo said. I was wrong to be the man who didn't give it to you. Then why didn't you ask? Just once. Just why? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, it came out low and unguarded. Because asking would have meant admitting there might be a version of events where I was the one who'd failed you, not the other way around. It's easier to fire someone than to consider you might have spent 2 years not seeing the person standing 3 feet from your desk every single day. Elena's eyes stung, and she hated that they did. Hated that after everything, the eviction, the car, the cold, this was the thing that finally undid her. Not the crisis, the honesty. You don't get to fix 2 years of not seeing me with 1 week of guilt, she said, but the steel had gone soft at the edges. I know that too, Matteo said. I'm not asking you to forgive 11 minutes with 11 days. I'm asking you to let me spend considerably longer than that, proving I understood what I did wrong. However long it takes, I'm not in a hurry to be forgiven, Elena. I'm only in a hurry to stop being the man who didn't ask. She studied him across the table. The careful stillness, the rare crack of vulnerability he almost never let anyone see, least of all her. You were wrong about me, she said finally, quietly, testing the words like they were something new. Not just about the manifest, about who I was the whole time. You thought you had a competent assistant. You had someone who would have burned her own life down before she let anything happen to yours, and you never even noticed. I notice now, Matteo said. I notice everything now. It's the only apology I know how to give that isn't just words. Elena didn't answer right away. She sat with the weight of it. The anger that had kept her upright for 11 days finally allowed, for the first time, to loosen its grip. I'm still angry, she said. You should be. That's not going away, because you said the right things over dinner. I know, Matteo said. I'm not asking it to. The board meeting was scheduled for 9. At 8:45, Matteo walked into the penthouse kitchen, found Elena at the counter with her coffee, and set a folder in front of her. What's this? My announcement, he said. For the board, for the captains, for anyone who spent the last 2 weeks wondering why the woman I fired is currently living in my home, with full security clearance. Elena flipped it open, scanning the first page, her eyebrows rising. Matteo, this says Director of Internal Operations, reporting directly to you. It does. You can't just, This isn't a way to apologize. This is a job. A real one. With actual authority. It's not an apology, Matteo said. It's a correction. You were doing that job in every way that mattered for the last year of your employment. I simply never gave you the title, or the trust, or the transparency that should have come with it. I'm not offering you charity, Elena. I'm offering you what should have already been yours. Elena set the folder down carefully, the way she'd once set down that crumpled $5 bill, and looked at him. And if I say no? If I decide I want nothing to do with this organization, or you, ever again? Then I sign whatever severance and reference you want. I never mention it again, and you walk out of here with my genuine hope that the next chapter of your life is easier than the one I gave you, Matteo said. And there was no calculation in it, none of the controlled negotiation she'd spent 2 years learning to read. Just plain, unguarded honesty. I'm not going to make my staying in your life a condition of anything, Elena. Not the job, not the security, not this apartment. If you want a different one, you get to choose, freely, without owing me the choice you make. That's very noble of you to say the morning of a board meeting where you clearly need my answer. The corner of his mouth lifted, the first real, unguarded smile she'd seen from him in longer than she could remember. Fair. I'd like an answer. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But wanting an answer and requiring one aren't the same thing. Elena walked to the window. The harbor spread gold and quiet in the early light, so different from the flickering, rain-slicked parking garage where all of this had started. She thought about 11 nights in the back seat. She thought about the $5 bill, and the diner, and Viktor Kovalenko's folder full of leverage that had turned to nothing in her hands the moment she'd refused to be afraid of it. I'm not doing this because I'm grateful, she said finally, turning back to face him. I want that understood clearly, before I say anything else. I'm not the woman from the car anymore, desperate enough to take whatever's offered. I know exactly who you are, Matteo said. That's precisely why I'm asking. Then yes, Elena said. I'll take the position, not because you feel guilty, and not because it's convenient. Because you're right. I was already doing the job, and I'm good at it, and I'm done letting anyone, including you, forget that. Something eased in Matteo's shoulders, relief, and something warmer moving through his expression. And the rest of it? The rest of it, Elena said, we figure out slowly. No penthouse timelines, no grand declarations because a rival family showed up with a folder. I get my own place eventually, when I'm ready, not because I have to run from anything, but because I choose to. And you don't get to skip the part where you actually earn this, one ordinary day at a time. The same way anyone else would have to. That's more than fair. I know, Elena said, and for the first time in weeks, something like a real smile broke across her face. I intend to make you work for it, Matteo. No more shortcuts. No more decisions made in 11 minutes. No more decisions made without asking, Matteo agreed, closing the distance between them, close enough now that neither of them stepped back. No more backseat nights, Elena. Whatever this becomes, however long it takes, you're never sleeping somewhere cold again, because I failed to ask a single question. Elena looked up at him. 11 days of exhaustion and fury finally settling into something quieter, something that felt, for the first time since the rain and the flickering streetlight, almost like the beginning of solid ground. Then ask, she said. Starting now. Ask me everything you should have asked 2 years ago. And in the gold morning light spilling across the harbor, Matteo Russo, a man who had built an empire on swift, ruthless certainty, finally learned to do the one thing that had eluded him his entire life. He asked, if you love this story and want more captivating Mafia romance story, subscribe to Mr. Mafia Boss. I'll see you the next one. Take care.